So hello, everyone, and welcome to Strategies for a Suitable Income in Retirement. For those of you who were not there when we had this discussion, please hold all of your questions until the end of the webinar. You can type your questions in either the chat box or the Q&A box during the webinar. I'll be monitoring both places, and at the end, I'll read those questions out loud. Our speaker tonight is Mark Lange. Mark started his career as an intern developing computer models in the commodities markets. He very quickly learned that this was not the area of his calling, as it did not offer the reward that helping others gave him. This desire led him to join American Express Financial Advisors. During his time at American Express, Mark completed the College of Financial Planning's CFP professional education program and became a training and district manager. Mark then moved from American Express Financial Advisors to LPL Financial. He is a past member of Putnam Investments Gold Scale Council and Goldman Sachs Blue Chip Council, as well as a former host of From Wall Street to Main Street on radio station WTBQ in Warwick, New York. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Mark.
Thank you so much. It's always nice to get a warm introduction like that. And I want to thank you all for joining me tonight for Strategies for a Sustainable Income in Retirement. Typically, when I do these, I like to tell people a little bit about why my partners and I decided to join SOFA many years ago. SOFA was really designed as a nonprofit organization to improve the financial literacy, essentially one community at a time. And so it's our pleasure to bring what we call our core elements to many of our different libraries as well as senior organizations. This is the third one in the series. Our first one is Social Security Explained. Second one is Asset Allocation and Risk Management. 3 is Strategies for Sustainable Income in Retirement. And ultimately, the fourth one is Estate Planning. But before we get started, SOFA is not here to sell product. As I said, it's a nonprofit organization. It's been in existence since 1993. And I am here tonight to provide you with educational components. We're going to talk about some different things. Occasionally, I may use a product to kind of illustrate a particular point relative to the types of things that are available. So for example, sometimes I'll talk about annuities and I'll talk about some of the riders that are out there and how they work. But if you have questions, please feel free to ask me. As part of our commitment to SOFA, we offer anybody who has questions on their personal situation to reach out to us by email. I have my email at the end. Feel free to do so. You get an hour consultation. It's completely free. In many instances, I can help direct you in the right direction if you have some questions about these different areas. So let's get started. Normally, I'd ask you for evaluation forms if we were doing these live. In 2023, it looks like we will start to get back to doing more of these events live, but right now we're not. So we're just going to get started into creating that sustainable retirement income. So what's the most important thing that I say to people when we talk about developing strategy for income and retirement? Well, it's developing a game plan. Because as the old saying goes, there's very few people who plan to fail, but there's a lot of people who fail to plan. In yellow on this particular slide are 2 really significant components. The first one is longevity. And I highlight these for a very specific reason. That last designation that you saw, RICP, which is Retirement Income Certified Planner, one of the biggest elements that we're seeing from the 2 academic leaders in the field, which is Dr. Wade Pfau and Dr. Moshe Milevsky, is people are under planning for their longevity. This is very significant. When I was a kid, if somebody said to me, how many people did you know in your 80s? Well, I knew a couple of people. But if they said how many in their 90s, I couldn't think of anybody. And I certainly didn't know anybody over 100. Today, if you ask me that same question, I know lots of people in their 80s. I know a ton of people in their 90s. And I actually know quite a few people today that are at 100 years old. So people are living much, much longer, and they're having to plan for those elements longer term. I'm going to show you a couple of slides and why that's very significant. Higher prices today. We've seen the impacts of a highly inflationary environment for the last year and a half. It's going to be a little bit before these inflationary pressures come back under control. We've got a number of systemic elements within the confines of the economic system that dictate that this will not be a quick turnaround. One of those big elements is that third one, rising medical and long-term care costs. In fact, If you talk to virtually any estate planning attorney today, one of the first things that they're going to talk to you about within the first half hour is, what have you done to plan for long-term care costs? Why? If you've reached the age of 65, you have a 70% plus probability that you will have a long-term care stay over the remainder of your life. That's very significant. And the big question that I ask people up front is, who is going to be the caregiver? Because in most instances, it's the other spouse. And in many instances, putting the other spouse under that kind of duress really creates significant problems, both physically and financially. And then these other two elements, possible changes in Social Security, we know that that's going to happen. And why do we know it's going to happen? Because Social Security is essentially only fully funded through 2033 today, as per the trustees' reports for Social Security. And then the investment risks. We're already seeing the volatility factors. And if you're in the distribution stage, as I like to say, accumulation for retirement is when amateurs do very, very well. However, during the distribution phase, mathematics are critical, and understanding how to do risk management is absolutely imperative. So when I talk about that age factor, let's talk about some of these key elements. So for an individual who reaches age 65 today, you can be expected to live to an average age of 84. Well, the average life expectancy today for males and females is early 80s. The issue with this is, if you've reached 65 today, your probability of reaching 84 is very high. What's your probability of reaching into the 90s? Well, I'm going to show you that today. And you can see for women, it's even higher, the probability that you're going to live longer. So what's the key element here? You've got to prepare for many more years in retirement than you thought. Very important to remember that moving forward. So after you reach 65, what's the probability of living to the following ages? You can see exactly what they are right there. But folks, look at that. If you've reached age 65, you have a greater than 50% chance that you're making it to the early to mid 80s. You've got a 1 in 3 chance of making it to the late 80s, and you've got greater than a 1 in 10, almost a 1 in 9 chance that you're going to make it to the mid 90s. Probability for a married couple, age 65 today, that one of the two makes it to the early to mid 90s, almost 50%. So you're going to have to plan for a lot longer period of time than you thought. Very important to think about that. Here's how the multiples work out. Essentially, many people will say to me, Mark, how do I determine what the costs are going to be in the future? Well, it's simple. If you want to use a 3% inflation factor and you want to find out what something's going to cost in 20 years, you simply take the price today and multiply it times 1.8. 1.81. If you want to find out for 30 years, you multiply it by 2.43. That's at 3%. That is at 3%. Let me show you some really significant items. Here's the cost of inflation at 3%, going from 2022 out 20 years and then 30 years. So a bottle of milk today, which sells for $4.41 at a 3% inflation factor, in 30 years is going to be $10.70. Your car will go from an average of $48,000 a year today to $116,000. And a $350,000 home becomes almost $850,000. A $60,000 retirement expense becomes $145,000. That's at 3%, folks. What has inflation been growing at? Well, as you can see at the bottom of this slide, it says healthcare spending has been projected at an annual average growth rate from an inflationary standpoint is 6.2%. So let's plug that number in. Let's plug in 6 and see what things look like. At 6%, your bottle of milk went from $4.41 to over $25. Your $48,000 car became a $275,000 car. And your $350,000 home became essentially a $1.2 million home. So these numbers have grown exponentially, and a $60,000 retirement becomes a $344,000 retirement. That's at 6% in 30 years. How many of you have planned for this moving forward? I would venture to say not many. It's not something that people want to think about. Here's the cost today on average. This is the average cost for medical and long-term care costs across the country. That's not specific to the New York metropolitan area. The New York metropolitan area is higher. The average cost for a long-term care stay in the New York metropolitan area today is almost $140,000 a year. That's not including meds. So folks, very significant things that you have to pay attention to. What's the probability we're going to see changes to Social Security, or what we call OASDI, old age survivors and disability insurance? Well, they're very high. The Board of Trustees, when they reported in 2020, anticipated that we'd start to see a decrease in 2021. And quite frankly, that was before the pandemic hit. They expect this full payment for benefits will stop in 2033, and there's an anticipation that we'll see as much as a 20% or 21% reduction in those benefits. So how will many people be able to offset those? They will have to wait and apply for Social Security later so that they get a higher amount than their full retirement amount or their FRA amount when they would have had their original retirement dates. So for many people, they're going to push out and postpone taking Social Security till age 70. It's a wise decision for many. When we talk about income tax rates, I have people tell me constantly, these are some of the highest income tax rates we've ever seen. Well, folks, take a look at this chart. They're not the highest income tax rates we've ever seen. If you go back to the latter stages of the 1940s all the way through the 1960s, you saw top marginal brackets up in the 80s and 90s percentile. And I have to be perfectly candid. With $31 trillion of federal debt and almost $17 trillion of state obligations, those tax rates, I think, moving forward, are going to have to go up. Someone is going to have to pay for this debt as we go further along, number one. And number two, we're seeing the rates on that debt rise and rise rapidly now. So that is going to impact how much of the national budget can be used for other elements other than supporting just the cost of that debt as we move forward. So these are very significant and very important elements that you're going to have to deal with. How do most people tackle this? Well, they're gonna basically put together an investment portfolio, and that means that you're going to have to pay attention to a couple of things. One, you're going to have to pay attention to risks and returns. You're going to have to pay attention to interest rates. But for most people, they're going to stay invested primarily in stocks, especially for the long term. Why? Because they've historically provided us with the highest rates of return. But now many people are also going to need to generate income. Well, the intriguing part about that is, if I go back to when I first started planning, and this is my 44th year in the industry, when I first started to do planning, we were talking about investment grade bond portfolios generating someplace between 5.75% and 7% as an average rate of return from investment grade bond portfolios. About 3 years ago, if I talked about the same quality portfolio, I couldn't get 3.25%. So I was looking at yields that were less than half of what people did their projections on 30 and 40 years ago when they started to do their computations of what they would need for retirement. So it's very important to understand, how do these things play out, especially as we move further along. And of the factors that are going to impact you, there's two really significant ones when you get into retirement. First, the erosive effect of inflation. We're already seeing that. And even for the people who are working, they're seeing the erosive impacts. Imagine what it's like for you when you're in retirement, you don't have the capacity to go back to work and combat those inflationary pressures. And secondarily, downside years and how they affect your principal. For many people, they don't take this into account, especially when we talk about developing income distribution strategies during retirement. So many people are caught up in the, well, I had a balanced portfolio, it averaged 8% a year while I was in the accumulation stage for 35 years. I'll just leave it alone and that'll be perfectly fine. Well, that may be perfectly fine if you don't need the dollars. If you do, you now are going to have a perpetual tap on those dollars to generate income because you need that through retirement. If I went back to the 1940s and 50s, we had approximately 80% of the people had retirement plans that were defined benefit plans, which were pension plans. Today, 85% plus of all of the retirement plans are what? Defined contribution plans, 401ks, 403bs, 457s, all things we can define how much you put away, but we have no idea what you're ultimately going to be able to get out of those portfolios. However, the Secure Act of 2019 requires all of those qualified plans to produce at least once a year what your anticipated income benefit will be at retirement. I would caution you to the following. You're probably going to be rudely awakened on how low those income distributions are going to be. Please look at them ahead of time and guide yourself accordingly. You should really be actively planning for retirement a good 10 minimum to 15 years ahead of time. My niche market for many years has been upper level college executives, and I've worked diligently with many of those to stop them from contributing as much on the pre-tax side, because when they get into retirement, they've lost the deductibility, they don't have the expenses for kids, and now they're paying full freight through all those brackets with no deductions. Very important to run those numbers before you get out there and make modifications if they're necessary for you. What's one of the key things that people don't understand with regards to bonds? Well, let me explain to you how they work. If yields rise, your bond price drops. And if yields drop, your bond prices rise. So what's happened over the last 30 years? Well, what we saw was interest rates from the 40 years, sorry, I missed a decade. For the last 40 years, we've gone from an interest rate environment from latter stages of the 1970s and the early 1980s that was extremely high and went to an extremely low period of interest rates starting basically around 2005. For those of you who want to look a little deeper, 2010, post the 2008 bear market. And what have we been in since then? An extremely low interest rate environment. What's happened over the last year and a half? Interest rates have begun to rise. So let me explain to you how this equation works. So a bond gets issued, and let's say that the average credit quality here was a single A, just for example purposes. So we issued a $1,000 bond, so that would be the middle line looking from left to right, and it had a coupon or a yield of 10%, and it pays $100 worth of interest. That never changes. If I want to make the bond available for sale in the open market, I then have to say, well, what will that credit quality of bond yield today? Well, if interest rates went down, let's look at the bottom line here, that 10% bond shouldn't yield 10% anymore. It should only yield 5%. So I have to make the interest column on the right equal to a 5% yield on the bond. That means my bond is now worth $2,000. So I've seen $1,000 of capital appreciation because the interest rates dropped. So we adjust the value of the bond itself in the open market. Conversely, we've seen the opposite recently. So that same bond, which originally was a $1,000 bond with a 10% yield, I have to now make that $100 worth of interest. I have to make it equal a 20% yield because interest rates have gone up. So as you can see, what happened to the price of my bond? It dropped to $500. So for many of you that are in high quality investment grade bonds or even government bonds during an interest rate upside move, what are you seeing with the principal in your bond portfolios? It's deteriorating. What happens when you have to take income at the same time? It certainly makes one think about whether or not this is the only place that you should be positioned in terms of bonds that you own. You may want to have a more diversified portfolio that has different levels of risk than just the investment grade category, number one. And number two, can you take on that risk? And do you understand what that means? It is very important to understand that. If you don't, get with a good professional who can explain to you what those implications are, because I guarantee you, you're going to have to deal with them for the rest of your life. So as I said before, we talked about those interest rates. When bond prices are high, income from interest rates typically are going to be down and vice versa. So it's a very simple equation. If you see interest rates going up, your bond values are going to drop. On the opposite side, if you see interest rates dropping, your bond values are going to increase. It's going to be a portion of your portfolio. For some of you, it may be a large portion. For some of you, it may be a very small portion. So the appropriate allocation, that's something you're going to have to determine either on your own or in conjunction with a professional who can help you to determine that. So let's start out first and foremost when we want to create a retirement income by first identifying the sources of the income, choosing a rate of withdrawal that fits for you relative to two things. What are your needs and what can you afford to take out of the portfolio? Because how much you decide to take out and the rate that you decide for withdrawal will determine probably how long those dollars are going to last. Managing risk. Managing risk becomes so much more important during the distribution phase. As I like to say, accumulation phase is what I call the amateur portion. The professional portion comes during the distribution phases. You want to address the specific risks that are applicable to you. And then lastly, will you potentially be using a Roth IRA as a tax strategy? Why? Because for those people who are sitting in a situation where provisional income, which is a key element that I'll talk about a little bit later, provisional income may be one of those elements where you look at it and you say, boy, if there was just another way for me to get more income to come in and not impact how much of my Social Security was taxed, I could reduce the bill on my Social Security from taxes. Roth IRAs have the capability to do that. So in many instances, when I work with my clients and we're talking about retirement 10 or 15 years out, we're looking to do what? We're looking to convert many of those pre-tax assets to Roths so that in the future years, we don't see this big bite that we would be having from the pre-tax elements, number one, because of the fact that we've got required minimum distributions, but secondarily, Roths don't have RMDs or required minimum distributions. So if you don't need the dollars, you'd be far better off leaving them sit there to accrue for the next generation. So let's look at those sources. And I basically look at them from two standpoints, one, early retirement, and two, latter stages of retirement. So typically early in retirement, people are either doing part-time or full-time work. And by the way, folks, I can't tell you how many times, for me, with my niche market as college executives, I can't tell you how many times they've said, absolutely, we're just going to go to a part-time work when we retire. You can't change the spots on leopards, folks. Many of these people are going to continue to work all through the retirement. But there's also many people who are anticipating that they're going to continue to work either part-time or full-time. And one of two things transpires. One, health reasons dictate, hey, I can't continue to work the way that I am. Secondarily, reduction in force from companies. So be quite sure about your projections with regards to working in retirement, because so many times it changes. Pension income, not many people have it, but if you do, you're sitting in the catbird seat. One of the key elements that we talk to individuals about when we do retirement planning is we try to get as many assets as we possibly can to be guaranteed types of incomes. Why? More guaranteed income allows you to maintain a higher risk profile on the remainder of your assets and hopefully be able to generate greater returns over time. And then Social Security, that is the primary source of guaranteed income for most people. The question becomes, when do you plug into it? And are you talking about just you, or are you taking into account your spouse? So very important to give that some thought. And then later into retirement, potentially IRA withdrawals. That can be an early stage element, depending upon your financial situation. I won't get into the depths of that because we could get into the discussion of that for probably a good hour to 2 hours. Real estate, for many people, they're hopeful that they will be able to turn those things on to income generators in retirement. For some of you, you may be able to do so. And for some of you, you may not be able to do so. And I'll give you a specific reason as to why. Many of the people who live in the New York metropolitan area, which is an area that I'm quite familiar with and deal with lots and lots of clients, I see people in many instances do what when they get to retirement? They sell their real estate up here, or they keep their real estate up here and use it as what? An income generator while they're in another state. One of the most difficult things to do is to be a long distance landlord. It creates many problems. And so sometimes that real estate investment element doesn't work overly well. And then 401k withdrawals, I kind of categorize those the same as IRA withdrawals. So under all those situations, you want to factor those pieces in and do the analytical work long before you retire. Let me repeat that. Long before you retire. Why? You want to give yourself time to make adjustments if you need to do so. Trying to make those adjustments a year before you're ready to retire, you're just not going to have a significant impact on it. So very important to think about it from those perspectives. This particular chart shows you if you choose different distribution rates, okay, in this particular portfolio that we're using for this, we're talking about having 50% in equities and 50% in bonds. Well, if you chose a 3% return or distribution rate, your asset should last you approximately 50 years. If you get up into that 6 and 7, which a lot of people base their distribution strategies on, you can see they're not going to last nearly as long. Now, in today's environment, we're not really talking about it so much because interest rates are changing so dramatically. But if we went back just a year and a half ago and we were having the same discussion, you used to have this thing called the old safe withdrawal rate. In other words, what was the withdrawal rate that you could take and not blow up your portfolio and not run out of assets? In the original calculations by Mr. Venking, it was 4%. Well, on the most recent ones that were done by Dr. Pfau and Dr. Molesky, we were down to about 2.75% in order to keep your portfolio from blowing up. So when we get into low interest rate environments, many people don't have the capacity to take those very low interest rates and digest them and say, I can live off of those. So you have to be aware that you may have to stretch out further into the investment arena and take on more risk in order to get the types of returns that you want to get. But there are many more of those vehicles today than there ever used to be in the past. Many, many more. There's many different types of distribution strategies today that are out there. I'm not going to get into all of them because there's probably a good 50 to 75 different types of distribution strategies. Everything from covered call writing to managed distribution strategies, both on an open-ended mutual fund basis as well as an ETF or exchange traded fund basis. There's also high distribution strategies applicable to closed-end funds. Some of them will have leveraging capacities attached to them. So there's many different types of investment vehicles that you can use to plug into your portfolio to generate these incomes. The other element that you may want to think about is, do you want to have a great deal of assets in investment grade vehicles that typically and historically are more interest rate sensitive than something that's more on the lower end of the investment grade scale or the upper end of what we call the lower grade scale, classically categorized as junk? Doesn't necessarily mean that it's junk, but those are much more economically sensitive than interest rate sensitive. So important to understand the difference between those. If you're not familiar with that, please get with a professional who can help to explain how those things work for you, because odds are you're probably going to employ some of those components. So when I talk about developing these strategies, I think of it in terms of 3-bucket approach. The first one being your short-term needs. And here I'm talking about things that you need to meet your immediate cash flow needs or an emergency fund. And you can see the items that are in that. It's cash, CDs, money markets, all short-term instruments. And immediate annuities, because quite frankly, immediate annuities, if you plug into one of them today, you're not going to get much of a return on them. The internal rates of return in many instances are much less today than what you would get out of a 10-year treasury. Your midterm bucket is really designed to be a replenishment for the first one, but still have a bit more of an orientation. So we're hopeful that we can get some growth and higher levels of income. Here we're looking at bonds or bond portfolios that have longer duration. But the key element to remember, the longer the duration that you plug into with your bond funds, the more interest rate sensitivity you will have. Please be aware of that. If you're just looking at these yields, please pay attention. Please, please, please pay attention to the duration of your bond portfolios, or you can get hurt very, very badly. I'll give you an example. If I have a portfolio that has a duration of 5 years, that means that if I see a 1% interest rate move to the upside, I will see a leverage of 5 to 1 on my principal on the downside. So 1% move up in interest rates with a 5-year duration would give me a 5% decrease on the value of my principal. So if you reach for a bond portfolio that has a higher yield and a longer duration, let's say you get out to 15 years, you have a 1% move up in interest rates, you could see a 15% decrease in your principal value. That's a devastating occurrence during the distribution phase for many people. And some of the typical components that you would see there outside of bonds would be some of the deferred annuities, as well as some absolute return fund strategies, as well as asset allocation and balanced funds. And then lastly, that longer term bucket would really be something that we're planning to help us with the longevity issues. We're hopeful to use it as an inflation hedge. And here we're talking about growth stocks, growth funds, real estate, commodities, or even businesses. Okay, there's a lot of people that are starting what I call sideline businesses, especially in retirement, and they're based off of hobbies. So those are another way that people can generate some nice sizable amounts of income in retirement. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, because this is a key element for people to think about, especially as we get into retirement. What happens to bond prices when interest rates rise? Well, I just explained to you what transpires there. What happens to an income-oriented portfolio when income is taken in a rising interest rate environment? Let me give you an example. From 2000 through 2002, we had 3 consecutive negative years. For many people during that period of time, they still had to take income from their portfolios. Well, I was recommended to talk to quite a number of people at AT&T in early 2000. Many of those people were very reluctant to move out of their stock portfolios completely, and they would only add small amounts of bond portfolios to their portfolio. Well, for many of them who were taking 6 or 7% dividend yields or distribution rates off of those portfolios, if you had $1 million portfolio, you were going to take $60,000 of income. Well, if that's what you plan to live off of for the next 3 years, you pulled out $60K, and I'm not even adding the inflationary factor. So you pulled out $180,000 just in income to live off of. Meanwhile, you saw a 50% reduction in the value of your portfolio. So now your $1 million portfolio that you started with 3 years ago is now down to what? $320,000. That's not going to last you very long in retirement. So very important to anticipate these elements and have strategies to offset them. What happens to a portfolio if it starts out with negative returns in the early years? Well, I'm going to show you that. Couple all these pieces together, and the next logical question is, what other income options can help me lower my risks and improve my probabilities of not running out of money? You have to give a lot of thought here. You're going to see, for those of you that are in defined contribution plans like 401ks, 403bs, and 457s, you're going to see tremendous amount of new options coming to you regarding the distribution phase. Initially, they're going to start out as primarily annuity components. So you'll see a number of those pieces coming out within the next year. And with Secure Act 2.0, I think probably passing in the next session or two of Congress, those things are going to come very, very much into light in those plans. There will be also separate account managers and a number of other components that will be available. So stay tuned, folks, because from some of the things that I've seen, you may see as many as 30 to 40 different types of distribution strategies that come available in these 401ks and 403bs moving forward. This is the big retirement killer. Why sequence of returns matter. Let's first start out where it doesn't really matter. The sequence of returns may have less of an impact on the portfolio of a long-term investor who's no longer putting money in, nor taking money out. They don't need the money. However, that relationship between an investor's rate of withdrawal and the sequence of returns can have a dramatic impact on the portfolio's ability to last during the withdrawal period, which is usually their retirement. Let me show you how it works. How did I get back to my, no, I'm going in the wrong direction, sorry. So let's talk about the accumulation phase first, or what I call the factors that affect your portfolio before you retire. So in the top left-hand side, you can see in blue the accumulation phase. Here's the three key factors: your average annualized return, your asset allocation, and staying fully invested. In this example, we're assuming that we started with a $100,000 lump sum. We averaged 8% a year all the way through. And at age 65, these two individuals have the same amount of money, $684,000. So they did a great job. It really didn't matter the sequence of those returns during the accumulation phase, did it? No, really didn't. However, when we get into the distribution phase, boy, do things change. So now, what are the key factors? Well, first of all, sequence of returns. Second, product allocation. And third, portfolio protection. In this example, we took that $684,000 that they accumulated, and now we're going to distribute a 5% annual income, and we're going to adjust it each year for inflation. We're going to average 8% over a long period of time in both portfolios. But folks, look at the bottom left of this slide. Portfolio A has 0, portfolio B has 2.6 million. That is a huge difference. Why? Let's look at the left-hand side of this chart. Up at the top, next to age 66, in that orange color, those first 3 years were negative returns. Look at what happened to the portfolio in 3 years. It was more than cut in half, and we're only taking a 5% distribution. And by the time that they were 82, they had run out of money. That same portfolio, if it had 3 positive years to start with, not negative sequence of return years, all of a sudden, look at the amount of dollars that were left, and they had plenty of dollars left over even when they reached age 90. So it's very important to factor in sequence of return and another element called the high risk corridor. What is that? The high risk corridor is that period of time from when you transition from working into retirement. Those first 10 to 12 years really can have a dramatic impact on how long your retirement assets are going to last. And the earlier that you retire, the longer that high risk corridor is going to stay in play for you. Why? Because the more significant those adverse sequence of returns can be on you. So very important to pay attention to these things. And this is why I say to people, when you talk about retirement planning, it's time to meet with a professional. It's time to develop a good, sound game plan so that you can make it through years like this year where you're seeing tremendous amounts of volatility. What are the common sources that most people are going to have? Well, Social Security is going to be one. Defined pensions or defined benefit or pension plans. Some of you will have it. If you do, you're in the catbird seat. Most of you are going to have defined contribution plans, and you may be able to plug into annuities. These are becoming more and more popular. They certainly got beaten to death 10, 15 years ago because of the expenses that were attached to them. But as Dr. Milevsky says many, many times, if you think you're going to get your dollars back out of an annuity, you're not. You're going to lose purchasing power over time. But the biggest problem for most people is losing those dollars, period, through bad choices in terms of their investments. So in many instances today, you're seeing annuities with different riders that are attached to them do what? To encourage people to stay more fully invested in the markets, to give them the opportunity to get the average rates of return that they need, but at the same time, guarantee them income levels that they can depend on to live off of through retirement. So very important to pay attention. Let's go through the typical types on the annuity side. You have a single premium. Typically, you're funding it with one-time lump sum contribution. Flex, or as most variable annuities are set up today, you're going to do ongoing contributions. You're typically going to find that they're either a fixed type where they're getting a fixed rate of return, which is being dictated by the company each year, or a variable component, which is subjected to market risk. And you can see the same thing or the same type of element that has kind of a hybrid to it with many of these indexed annuities. So you can participate in an index's upside, yet not lose anything if the index doesn't provide you with a positive rate of return. But what do you give up for that? Well, that's pretty simple. You're going to give up some of that upside to have that downside protection. But for many of you, that's going to be a very, very important element. And then lastly, you've got deferred versus immediate. Immediate annuities, in many instances, in the old days when interest rates were extremely high, we used to use those to generate an income for a client, sometimes for a 10 or a 12 or a 15-year period of time, in the hopes that we could take and invest the remaining dollars that they had in a deferred status and ultimately go and be able to use those at a later date and hopefully produce a higher amount of income. So there's many different ways to go about utilizing these components, and you have to determine which ones fit for you and how do you mix and match them. Okay. Deferred fixed annuities, there's a couple of different types. There's also a longevity-based annuity, but many people are not finding these very attractive. Why? Because the guaranteed interest rates and the current interest rates are not enough to even keep pace with inflation. So they're not very attractive today. Excuse me. Deferred variable annuities are very popular today. Why? Because you can employ professional money managers. There's multiple investment options, usually multi-family, and they're typically designed as long-term investments. And you can add many of the different, what we call GMIB, guaranteed minimum income benefit riders, or GWI, guaranteed withdrawal benefits. So there's many different acronyms for these things, but the bottom line is there are ways to keep you fully invested in markets and also be able to generate a competitive rate of income while you live in retirement. And then ultimately, immediate annuities are really just lump sum investments, and they're designed to do what? They're designed to provide you with lifetime income. In many instances, when we have to provide income as a result of a trust beneficiary, an older trust beneficiary, it's not uncommon that we'll be forced to plug into those components. Sometimes they'll be dictated by the court, but in many instances, the primary reason that they're being used is why? They're things that people can't blow up, but historically, they're extremely low yield. So that's the negative attached to those pieces. So why do we talk about annuities in particular? Well, if you're using non-qualified annuities, you can take advantage of something called an exclusionary ratio. What does that mean? Well, for most of you out there, it'll be this simple. Let's say you put $100,000 ultimately into that annuity and it grew to be $200,000. Well, half of that is post-tax money that you put into it because you did it in a non-qualified account. So that means you put in post-tax dollars, and the only thing that you owe taxes on essentially is what? The growth in that portfolio. So when they start to pay out that contract, you annuitize that contract, some of those dollars that come back to you are going to be excluded. Why? Because they're a return of your principal. You've already paid taxes on them. And you're going to pay taxes on what? Only the portion of it that's growth. So you have an exclusionary ratio, and that will help you to navigate some of those tax issues. As I said before, lifetime income payout options, you can stipulate how you want your annuities to be paid out. You can take it over a single life, you can take it over a joint life, or you can take it over a period certain or a combination thereof. In many instances, you can have guaranteed death benefits to make sure that whoever's going to receive those dollars as time goes forward, it's going to be adequate to support what their needs are. But you have to look and see exactly how these pieces work and what are the different components that are attached to them. How do these death benefits work? Please, if you're not sure, take your time, digest them, and get with a professional who's going to take time to explain how they work. Then lastly, the optional living benefit riders. Sorry, I had a typo there. I'll have to change that one up. The living benefit riders today are one of the key elements that people employ to do two things. One, they want to stay fully invested in the marketplace to give themselves the opportunity for the highest rates of return. And two, they'd like to get competitive yields that, quite frankly, over the last 10 to 15 years, while these have become very popular, they couldn't find those same types of yields outside. So they become far more popular. And the big benefit of annuities is that you cannot outlive them, especially if you choose lifetime payout options. So, as I said earlier, let's not forget about one of the key elements, and that's provisional income. So people say to me, what the heck is provisional income? Well, provisional income is an element that helps us to determine how much of your Social Security is going to be taxed. How do we compute that? Well, we're going to take 50% of whatever your Social Security benefit is. We're going to add any ordinary income or any earnings that you have to that. We're going to add in any dividends and capital gains, and we're going to add in any non-taxable interest. So tax-free interest, tax-free bonds are going to get plugged into that provisional income calculation. What does not get plugged in there? Roth distributions. So if you have Roth distributions coming to you, that does not get added into that provisional income calculation. And for those of you that have done good, savvy planning for retirement and built up a pretty sizable nest egg in Roth accounts, you have two advantages. One, you don't have required minimum distributions. And two, you can invest in the higher yields that historically would have provided a nasty tax impact for you if it was an ordinary income element. But because of the fact that it sits inside of your Roth, you can ultimately make completely taxable elements tax-free. So big advantages. So how do you determine how this works? Well, I tell people it's a pretty simple equation. Think of it in terms of layers. You're going to first add up all your gross income. Then you're going to add in any tax-free interest that you've received. And then you're going to add in half of your Social Security, and that's going to determine your provisional income. And that's going to determine how much of your Social Security becomes taxable. Now, folks, here's the key thing that I want you to remember. When we talk about people who are living in the New York metropolitan area, in many instances, people are going to have sizable amounts of income that come to them, not just from Social Security, but also from their retirement plans. So in many instances, going through these calculations to determine how much of it's going to be taxable to you, well, if you're over these numbers, and you can see here very quickly, the top one is for a single individual. So if you're taking in over $25,000, between $25,000 and $34,000, you're going to have up to 50% of your Social Security is going to be taxable. Once you get to that 34%, $34,000 level, 85% of your Social Security is going to be taxable. And you can see the joint numbers below it, 32 and 44. Anybody who lives in the New York metropolitan area, in most instances, is going to pay for 85% of their Social Security is going to be taxable. I typically walk through this equation with people because you can see here we're talking about what? A total $60,000 distribution under both parameters. Under the first one, we take $20,000 from Social Security at the top with $40,000 coming from an IRA withdrawal. Here, we've got $50,000 of provisional income. Why? Half of the Social Security plus the other source of income. So half of Social Security was 10 plus the 40K of withdrawal. So you have 50K of provisional income. You can see how that works through for married filing jointly. So we take the 50 minus the 32,000, which is the first bracket, which leaves you at 18,000 above the 50% level. We take the 50% minus that top bracket, which is 44,000. Now you've got 6K, and we're going to add an additional 35% to get to that 85%. So you can see 55% is going to be taxable. Conversely, if we had 40,000 that came from our Social Security and only 20 came out of the IRA, we're showing a much lower provisional income of 40K, and you can see taxable implications are dramatically lower. So very important to work through those calculations, especially if you're on that lower end of the income levels. If you're above those, just plan on the following. You're going to pay very dearly for your Social Security. This is how it kind of shakes out. 40K of IRA with 20K of Social Security. Taxable Social Security was $11,100. So ultimately, the bottom line in this calculation was you're going to pay another $2,500 in federal taxation because of the fact that you didn't plan properly and take your distributions accordingly. Conversely, if we took 20K out of the IRA and we postponed and got a higher Social Security benefit, we lowered our provisional income. And in this particular example, we got it all the way down to zero. So you can see there's a big difference in terms of how you take those distributions, especially if you're at the lower ends of those areas. So here's some closing thoughts. A successful strategy will help you to create a sustainable income to retire, hopefully, in the lifestyle that you desire. But as I said before, you've got to start early. And it's essential to prepare for the certain and the uncertain risks. I can't tell you how many people don't plan for down years. They've got their dollars invested in the marketplace, but yet they're not anticipating down years. You have to anticipate those things, and you must have a strategy. One of the key things that I do with all of my clients, and I do annual reviews with clients every year, January through the end of March. When I first started, people used to say, boy, things don't seem to change that much during the accumulation phase. Well, maybe they don't. When you get into that distribution phase or close to it, you're going to see things change a lot. And historically, every year, we see fairly dramatic changes from year to year. But we want to develop a game plan. If things work out the way you expect, if things work out okay, and what if things don't work out the way you expect in the marketplace? What will you do? Make those determinations before you get into the downturn of the market. One thing I don't want you to do is be making decisions about your portfolio with your heart instead of your head. Use your head, make those decisions ahead of time so that you know what you want to do. And lastly, make sure that your strategies continue to evolve because things are changing. I mean, if you look at it today, interest rates have changed dramatically from where they were just 1 year ago. And lastly, I got a couple of quotes that I always like to leave you with. The first one is, money is a terrible master, but it's an excellent servant. That's from P.T. Barnum. And only buy something that you'd be perfectly happy to hold if the market shuts down for 10 years. That's probably one of the greatest investors of all time, Warren Buffett. I want to thank you all for joining me tonight. And at this point, I'm more than happy to open it up to Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you. And just as a reminder, you can put your questions in either the chat box or the Q&A box. I'll be looking at them both. And the first question that I have for you, I am 60 and have a conventional 401k IRA at work. Do you recommend I split it 50-50 Roth IRA if I retire in 7 years?
You have to do a couple of things first. You've got to sit down and run the numbers to determine what tax bracket you're in currently versus what tax bracket you expect to be in the beginning. And how will those distributions flow through to you? Is that the only element? Is it just the 401k? Do you have a deferred compensation plan coming in? Do you have any other elements that are going to come into play? Do we have to make decisions relative to Social Security for you and your spouse? So you can see there's a number of different variables. If you have specific questions about your situation, I didn't plug it in here. Shame on me. Let me get to the last slide. There is my email at the bottom. As I said before, you're entitled to an hour free consultation. Please reach out to me. I will point you in the right direction, or at least get you thinking in the right way so that you can look at your situation and say, yes, I feel pretty comfortable. I'm doing the right thing. Or no, I think I need to make some adjustments and make some changes. And how should I go about doing those things? And I'll give you the pros and cons of where you sit versus the optionality.
Excellent. Thank you very much. The next question in the chat box. If I am in my 40s, what percentage of my income would you suggest I invest?
As much as you possibly can. What I would recommend first and foremost, if you're participating in a pre-tax plan and you have an employer that matches your contributions, at minimum, you should be doing the max to match. So if they'll match you, for example, 100%, most safe harbor plans, let me explain how they work. Safe harbor plans typically provide an employer the ability to do what? Well, many of their highly compensated people still want to put money away, but if they can't pass what's called an ADP or an ACP test, which are two discriminatory tests that are run on retirement plans, sorry, I'm getting into the geeky elements here, but those are two of the key elements that have to be run on plans every year. In order for them to potentially avoid the pitfalls of those two tests, many will employ what's called a safe harbor. Safe harbor says, we'll allow you to get around those tests or a good portion of those tests by implementing a safe harbor, which says you'll match as a company 100% dollar for dollar on the first 3% and then 50% on the next 2. So if you put away 5, we'll give you a 4% match. Folks, that's a guaranteed 80% return on the money you put into your retirement plans. I don't know of how many people who can turn down an 80% guaranteed return. That should be minimum. Secondarily, if you have the ability to contribute to the maximum levels in a 401k or a 403b, please do so. For some of you, you will have a requirement that you can get the matches only if you do it on a pre-tax basis, but you wanted to do it Roth. Okay, fine. Do your pre-tax through the year, get to December, and do your conversions internally in the plan if you have the Roth capability. This way you got the matching components and now you do the conversion to Roth and you start that time clock, the 5-year time clock on the Roth ticking at that point. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
No worries, thank you. The next question I have in the chat, would you suggest that a Roth IRA is significantly better than a traditional IRA? How about for a younger person?
Absolutely. There isn't even a question here. If you're a younger individual, what are you earning? Let's say you're earning $35,000 or $40,000. You're early in your career. What's your tax brackets? They're incredibly low. Why don't you think about the advantages of what that Roth will produce for you 40 or 50 years in the future? Number one, you had tax deferral all through those years. You didn't get any deductibility of the Roth up front, but you got tax deferral. When you get out to retirement, guess what? The RMDs, or required minimum distributions, they're eliminated. You don't have to take money out. And there's no federal taxation. That is a windfall for my young people. When I'm setting up retirement accounts for many of my clients' children and grandchildren, we set them up exclusively in Roths as long as they have enough income to be able to fund them. The earlier, the better. If I could pull it up quickly, I have a lovely little Excel spreadsheet that I did a few years back called the Young Investor versus the Procrastinator. The Young Investor started out putting out $5,000 a year into their IRA, whether it was Roth or pre-tax, stopped after 10 years. They put in $50,000 total. On the other side, the individual who was the Procrastinator waited till age 30 to start making contributions and made $5,000 contributions every year to age 65. They put in $185,000. At the same average rates of return of 8% a year, that young investor will have almost $500,000 more than the Procrastinator, even though they put in less than 1/3 the amount. So folks, the earlier you can start, the earlier you can plug into Roth, the better, because you're not getting any tax deductibility of those pre-tax elements of any substantive nature early on. So please fund the Roth.
Thank you. The next question in the chat box, what does sequence of returns mean when you were talking about portfolio protection?
Sequence of returns, when they're negative, have a very significant impact on your portfolio. Let's explain it from a kind of simple bit of numbers, and I won't get too heavy into this. So let's make it easy. Let's say we start with $1 million portfolio. And rather than a positive year, we have a negative year. So let's say that first year is a really bad year in the market. So our $1 million portfolio in the first year went from $1 million, we lost 20%, we're down to 800,000. But you had to take an income distribution. Let's just keep it simple at 5%. So what was 5% of that original million? 50K. So now you're not at 800,000 at the end of your first year, you're down to 750. Let's say we lose another 10% the second year. So minus another 75,000. Now I'm down to 675,000, but I got to subtract another 50,000 for income. Now I'm down to 625,000. So I had 2 negative years in terms of sequence of return. My $1 million portfolio is down to $625,000 in 2 years. And all I did was take out 100,000 of income, because those sequence returns wind up being extremely powerful during the distribution phases. And in many instances, you cannot recover if those sequence returns are significant. 2000 through 2002 is 3 consecutive years. That's really tough for most people to put up with. But in some instances, we can see where 2 consecutive down years are very significant for people, or 2 or 3 years where they have very low returns and the distribution elements are significant on the portfolio. Hopefully that gives you a little clearer understanding.
Perfect, thank you. And the last question that I currently have in the chat box, oh, one more, oh no, that was just a thank you. The last question that I currently have in the chat box, can you have both a Roth and traditional IRA?
Absolutely. And in fact, you can have multiple ones. However, remember something, because when we get into the distribution phase, people many times have moved from one company to another. Let's say you've got a 401k with company A, you've got a 401k with company B, and you've got 5 individual retirement accounts. Let's say they're all pre-tax, or what we call traditional IRAs. Well, I can take whatever my required minimum distribution is out of my IRA, out of any one of those accounts, and I could do it in aggregate for all 5. So let's say I had one account that was very large, and I said, well, let me take the total amount of my required minimum distribution from all 5 of my IRAs out of this one. Well, you can do that, but you can't with 401ks. They have to be taken out of each individual account. Now, for me, as I said before, my niche market for many years was upper level college executives. I have many college executives that have worked for different colleges. What do they have? 403B here, 403B there, 403B over here. I have some that have 5 different 403Bs. And sometimes they didn't consolidate them into their next employer. So what do they have to do during retirement? Now you've got to contact all 5 of them and take a distribution. So I wish I could give you a simpler answer, but you can have both IRAs, both of a pre-tax and a Roth basis. But when you start to put all these pieces together, you really have to look at it from an overall game plan and strategy on how you're going to go about taking the dollars from these different areas.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So I don't see that we have any more questions in either the Q&A or the chat box. So I want to say a big thank you to everyone for coming out this evening to attend this webinar and taking time out of your evening. And Mark, I want to say a big thank you to you as well for coming out and giving this very educational and informational webinar this evening. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
All right, have a very good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.